At the turn of this century, Richard Brevard Russell Sr., who was to become the Chief Justice of the state of Georgia, built this home in Winder, Georgia, located 45 miles northeast of Atlanta. He died in 1938. But today, his eldest son and namesake, Senator Richard B. Russell, who was born and raised in Winder, still calls this his home. This is Portrait. Tonight, we present a conversational portrait of the senior senator from the state of Georgia, Richard B. Russell, as he reflects on his life and career with CBS News correspondent Harry Resoner. Senator Russell is considered one of the South's most respected spokesmen. As chairman of both the Senate Armed Services Committee and Defense Appropriations Subcommittee, he is also acknowledged to be one of the most influential and powerful men in the United States Senate. We will begin tonight's portrait conversation in just a moment. We now join Harry Resoner and tonight's guest on Portrait, the senior senator from Georgia, Richard B. Russell.
Senator Russell, what was the Senate like when you went there, 31 years ago?
Well, the Senate is always a Senate, but the habits of senators and the forms that they employed in addressing each other and the chair were very greatly different from today. The Senate was much more formal in those days, and I don't think that's altogether because I was a baby of the Senate for a while. They didn't address each other by their first names. Most of them wore morning coats and striped trousers every day. In the speeches that were made, it was very rare that a speech was read. They delivered from the floor, either from a few written notes or else the senators memorized them. It's much more difficult for the reporters in those days than it is today when it's all handed out to the press gallery. Generally speaking, I would say it was much more formal than it is today, and then we were not quite as rushed in business. And that's true even of the 100 days of the Roosevelt administration. We've had much more far-reaching legislation suggested in this administration than was suggested by President Roosevelt in the 100 days that are considered so revolutionary.
Do you regret this change, the coming of informality and more business?
No, I do not regret the informality. I think that the tremendous increase in business is testing the place of the Senate in our scheme of government. The Senate is an extraordinary institution. There's nothing exactly like it in any other government of which I have any knowledge, present or in the past. And it is really putting it to the test as to whether it can perform its function with this constant stream of legislation dealing with so many different subjects.
Do you think the quality of the Senate's work has suffered because of the increase in business?
I doubt that because, for one thing, we have much better facilities for information than we had then. When I came to the Senate, there were about 40 committees in the Senate, and most of them had one clerk or one staff member. Of course, we reorganized the Senate in 1947, and now we have much fewer committees, but we have very large staffs. Some of the committees have 30 or 40 men who are supposed to be trained in their specialty, and that has caused the Senate to be able to keep abreast of its work. Now, whether we'll be able to in the future, I do not know. I hope that we will, because I think that the Senate is the keystone in the arch of constitutional government.
Sometimes it looks to a layman reading the papers out in Iowa or somewhere as if the Senate just wasn't doing any work. Months go by and nothing happens.
Yes, that is always very deceptive at the beginning of a new Congress, particularly, because all legislation has to go through the committee process, and for the first 2 or 3 months, unless they start to change the rules at the beginning of the session, there's really nothing for the Senate as a body to do, because all of its members are working in the committees and are preparing the legislation that will come on the floor later on. As a matter of fact, all of the detailed drafting of legislation and supporting evidence is developed in the committee now. The committee is vital to the legislative process. And it's not always a bad sign when the Congress is not passing a great many bills. better not to pass any bill than to pass a bad bill.
Is that part of your idea of the function of the Senate, to slow
no
things
question
down?
about it. As far as bad legislation is concerned.
What about changes in yourself over 30 years as a senator? Are you a different kind of senator, apart from just being more influential than you were then?
Well, thank you for that. I don't know that I am, but I am somewhat different because of the difference in conditions. I went to the Senate in the office of governor of this state. We were in the very bottom of that terrible depression it started in 1929. It was a very shocking experience to have to sit up there in the governor's office, have men to come in with 4 or 5 children, say, my children haven't had anything to eat since the day before yesterday. I'm willing to do any work, can't find any work. And to be confronted with widespread suffering and privation. And I was therefore much more liberal in that period than I am today. I don't think I'm any more liberal than I would be if we had that kind of a condition. But I think our government is flexible enough. I adhere to the theory that we should try spending schemes when the economy is slowing down or is on dead center, and that when the gross national product is increasing, that's a time for the government to refrain from taxing its people too heavily and putting the money into federal ventures. Now, everybody subscribes to that in theory, but in practice, you can't, politics being what it is, you can't get them to follow it.
Senator, I think it was President Truman who said that you would have been an outstanding presidential candidate if you hadn't come from a southern state. Have you sometimes felt that being a southerner has been a disadvantage?
No, I don't think it's ever been a disadvantage. It's certainly, of course, has eliminated me from any consideration for the office of president. I was amused to notice that former Justice Burns in his book made practically the same statement that Mr. Truman did, and I read both their books, and I think that was the only thing that they agreed on. I was very highly flattered by that fact. Being from the South has, of course, eliminated me from any serious consideration, and I've been aware of that. But it has its compensations. I'm very proud of my Southern heritage, and I wouldn't have sacrificed it for any honor anywhere in the country.
Have you sometimes felt, particularly in the last 10 years, that you're fighting a rearguard action for a tradition that's going down to defeat?
Well, I couldn't, if I could not be frank and say that there are not times when I have a feeling of overwhelming frustration, and that I know that some of the legislation that I have opposed and will oppose will eventually be enacted. But I think it has served a very useful purpose to slow down that legislation. I think it has probably contributed as much to the peace and tranquility and the progress of the country as the passage of legislation in other fields. I'm well aware that we are living in a social revolution, but I don't want it to be used to destroy our constitutional system. And there are times when it seems that the American people are almost hysterical and that they will resort to any palliative that's offered to correct immediately what we all admit are social injustices and economic injustices. But I believe that those things can be cured without destroying this great American system of ours.
When you say that you admit that there are social and economic injustices, does that mean, for instance, that in the field of in the relation with Negroes, that you would expect the things they want to happen immediately to happen eventually?
Well, I certainly hope that in the economic field they will happen eventually. But one of the things that I think that has caused us to lose our perspective has been the fact that no one ever talks about anyone except our Negro citizens as being underprivileged. As a matter of fact, if you were to get to 20 million white people who are at the bottom of our economic heap, their lot is worse than that of our 20 million Negro citizens. They have less educational opportunities, their income would be smaller, their property ownership would be smaller, And those people overlooked because the Negroes have these articulate leaders, and they are registered and they are voted as a group by a few leaders, whereas the 20 million whites don't have any leadership, and many of them don't vote. As a practical matter, I expect few of them, I know few of them vote than do our Negro citizens. I think that we must attack this business of economic disadvantage on a much broader front than the racial front, because it isn't confined to the Negro race.
Do you think there are dangers in the current almost explosive drive toward social equality?
Yes, I do, and I think that it's gotten somewhat out of hand. And I have publicly deplored the fact that the President has impliedly, at least, until his last civil rights message, had encouraged these demonstrations, which I think is very bad. I think the President of the United States should support the laws of this country, from the ordinances of the meanest hamlet of the country to the written word of the Constitution itself. I'm not sure that I know the President didn't realize just what was developing here, but it could well be that he has turned the genie out of the bottle now, and he will have great difficulty getting it back in. Well, Mayor Daley, who's from Chicago, who has been considered one of the great champions of all this so-called misnamed civil rights legislation, both on the state and a national level, and one of the President's principal political lieutenants, was booed by the Negroes here within the last weeks.
I noticed the portraits on the wall. Your parents, Senator?
Yes, that's my father and my mother. They are two very wonderful people. They sent 13 children into the world from this house, and they are resting in our family cemetery about 200 yards back of the house.
I'd certainly like to see that cemetery.
Well, I'd be very happy to have you go up there.
We will rejoin Harry Reasoner and tonight's portrait guest, Senator Richard B. Russell, in just 1 minute. We return you now to Harry Reasoner and tonight's portrait guest, Senator Richard B. Russell.
There, Mr. Reasoner, is a memorial to my father. My father and mother are buried there. I have a brother who's buried here, little nieces, the other graves. This is not an old family cemetery, as many of them are in the South, because my people moved up to this section from the low country. And my father moved here shortly after he married my mother.
Is that a Southern custom, a family burial plot?
Well, it's an old custom. It's outdated now. I suppose this is one of the last ones I know. It's an old custom. In the old days, they did always bury their members of the family on the family lands.
I think you said out of 13 children who survived, you were the only one who didn't marry. Now, how'd that happen, Senator?
Well, that's a question I've been asked many times, and I've asked myself many times. I think it's because I was too ambitious to start with. I wanted to be governor of Georgia younger than any man had ever been in history. I didn't have any money. It was in the nature of a gamble, and I knew if I lost, I would be in for many hard years, and I didn't want to subject any woman's love to that test. So I didn't marry until after I was elected, and somehow after that I didn't get around to it. Didn't have time.
Maybe is that a good idea for senators? Has it given you more time?
No, well, it certainly permitted me to have more hours to work. I can spend 2 or 3 more hours in my office than my married associates can, because their wives demand their presence occasionally. But I would not recommend it to anyone. If I had my life to go over again, I would certainly get married.
Senator, Georgia has a one-term limit, or at least one term at a time for governors, doesn't it?
Yes.
And the presidency now is limited to 2 terms. Have you ever thought that maybe that might be a good idea for senators, too, or do you think that continuity is important?
Well, I think continuity is quite important. Naturally, I would, as self-interest is served by that, but I think it stands to reason in any event that continuity is very important, because learning legislation and some issues are before the Senate for year after year. The tariff, for example, has been an issue since the infancy of the country. And it's so complex that a man can stay there 10, 12 years and not understand all of its details. And when he comes in there as a new senator, he is very badly handicapped. Continuity is wonderful up to the time when a man becomes physically and mentally weak. Then it's very bad. I've seen some senators who stayed in the Senate too long.
Something you can't always tell yourself.
That is right. They can't tell. They should have a friend or a commission to tell them. There have been 3 or 4 very tragic instances where men who had been giants departed with a great deal of the glamour knocked off because they stayed for 2 or 3 years when they were not capable of doing any real work.
Senator, I suppose this cemetery and a lot of other things that the country is aware of represent a Southern tradition that you said you were proud of, proud enough so you didn't mind not ever having been a presidential possibility. Is this going to go? Is the South, as you know it, dying?
Well, the old South, in a way, is dying. I don't know whether it's dying or whether it's really changing its way of life. I like to think of it in that way. It's changing its way of life in this century with the tempo of things accelerated as it is. It's impossible for the South to indulge in the slow and easy way of life that our fathers knew. I don't mean by that they didn't work, because they did, particularly the women. The women in the old South did more work than any person that you've ever heard of.
They weren't the Southern ladies just sitting around sniffing.
Oh, my heavens, you look at their day books and all. Well, my own mother, we have the books where she counted 162 garments she made for children in 1 year, and she wrote to every one of them that was away every week, and she looked after the house. And in addition, she was doctor and nurse for 4 or 5 poor families who lived on our place. They were the hardest working people on earth. There was no glamour about that, but it was a good life, and they loved it.
How is it, what do you see your nephews, for instance, or I suppose you may have some grandnephews by now?
Yes, I do have a number of them.
How do they differ, what they do, from what you did when you were a child around here?
Well, there's a great deal of difference, principally in the change in our economy. I can simplify it by Christmas. When I was a young boy, we looked forward to Christmas, but we got a big bunch of raisins and an orange and an apple and a banana and some what we call bucket candy and perhaps 3 or 4 chocolate drops. But today, Christmas is an event where they get all kinds of toys and bushels of things. They have a great deal more than we do. I only hope that it doesn't soften their fiber by having too much.
You think it's, some people say that you tend to get a good old days complex. Do you think you have one, or do you think
No, I don't think we can exchange it. Don't think we should. But I do hope that we can profit by the best things that were in the old life, because there was much in there that was highly desirable.
What about the traditions of the South? That some people now who attack the South would say that they depended to a very great extent on an unfair system to the Negro and to the poor Southern white. Was that so? Was this an unfair kind of a part of the country?
Well, I don't think it's nearly as unfair as some of our economy is today. We've never had any instance in human history of which I have any knowledge where the man at the bottom of the heap could get exact justice in the courts or elsewhere. I think he did it as nearly then as he almost as nearly then as he can now. Well, of course, the slaves had no freedom of movement, and they were liberated, and it's a good thing for the country. It was a drag on the South and on the Southern economy. It tied us to an outmoded way of agricultural life and denied any hope for industrial development. I think that it's better as it is now, though I would like to see the Negro population a little more fairly distributed throughout the nation. We have an unfair proportion of it to deal with the change of the times. In other words, we have 40 counties in Georgia that have more Negroes than whites, some of them 5 times as many. That presents an entirely different problem when you come to what you call your forced association bills from what it does to some man looking down from the Olympian heights of the Metropolitan Club or the Union League Club in New York City.
Is it a soluble problem? Is the kind of argument that is going on now
Well, it's got to be solved. We've got to solve it.
if you could, would
It's
you...
just a question of how. I don't think it's going to be overnight, and I think it's going to cause a good deal of travail and suffering and perhaps agony. But it's one that we've got to solve.
I think there have been a couple of television programs done on the idea of who speaks for the South. Well, who does? Does somebody like you who thinks it has to be solved?
Well, I don't know. I think most Southerners are aware of that fact. Few of them may not admit it. The big difference is as to how we solve it and the rate of the solution. Some people want to solve it overnight. Others think that it's something that, taking human nature into account, is something that hasn't changed very greatly through all the ages, that you must proceed to get people accustomed to these things by degrees.
I think that you, while being spoken of as a very conservative Southern leader, you also rejected a splinter party nomination in 1948, didn't you?
Yes,
Do you think that they're going to solve this within the framework of the present two parties?
I'm not, I don't know. I couldn't answer that categorically. I think that large segments of the South would be more inclined to leave the Democratic Party today than they have been heretofore. I have suffered through many years of trying to solve this thing within the Democratic Party, and I haven't given up yet. That's the reason I rejected that idea in 1948. President Truman has said that he won that time without the South, but he didn't, and he wouldn't have been elected without the South. He only lost 4 states, I believe it was, that he lost. But we have tried very hard to solve it within the Democratic Party, and if we could get the slightest understanding on the part of some of our very extreme associates in the party from other sections, I think we could. But both the parties today are bidding very earnestly for this Negro Bloc Vote. It's about 20% of the vote of the country, although 12, 15% of the vote of the country, and it is can be more nearly delivered as one than any other group, including organized labor or anything else.
After 31 years in the Senate and a lifetime in the South, if you could sum it up in a final question, would you say you felt optimistic or pessimistic about the future of the Republic?
Well, I am never going to abandon hope for this Republic because it's the nearest thing to perfection. Human institutions never reach perfection. We must always strive for perfection, but they never do. Our institutions are as near perfection as man has ever devised, and I have not yet lost faith in the common sense and the balance and sense of justice of the American people. I believe I'm an optimist when it comes to this country. I wouldn't sell it short. I think that we'll work this out, and our civilization will endure and be an inspiration to and an illustration to the people of other lands, particularly these new countries.
Thank you, sir.
We will return to Portrait and Harry Reasoner after this message.
A reporter learns that in every story, no matter how apparently cut and dried, there are men of goodwill who disagree, who are worth listening to. In the great American revolutionary story of the 1960s, the least understood group are the intelligent Southerners, the men of goodwill, who may or may not be right, who may or may not prevail, but who are worth listening to. Tonight, you've listened to Senator Richard Russell.
Portrait has been a production of the Public Affairs Department of CBS News and was pre-recorded on videotape.
This is the CBS Television Network.